In my opinion, the most important thing you can do as an aspiring writer is to think and thus write in the active voice. And by the end of this video, you'll not only understand why this is, but exactly how this is done. For those of you who don't know, the active voice is when you write, "The hammer struck the nail," versus the passive, "The nail was struck by the hammer." Note how in the active voice, the verb struck immediately follows the subject performing the action, the hammer, while in the passive voice, the verb follows the object that the action is being performed on, with the word was sandwiched in between, and precedes the subject performing it. If you want to learn how writing in the active voice also makes your writing more concise and all the benefits that come along with concise writing, then check out my earlier video on that. Links in the description below. Now, when you insist on writing in the active voice, your daily word count may go down a little bit, initially, but believe me, 100 words written actively is worth 1,000 written passively. Because when you edit a story written in the active voice, you don't have to change the sentence structure much, whereas editing passive writing is little different than rewriting. So save yourself the headache and the cost of several keyboards smashed over your forehead, and follow along as I show you exactly how to write in the active voice, and how it allows you to show instead of tell. In case you don't already know, telling is when you say, "The man was angry," and showing is when you say, "The man slammed his fist upon the table." Here, it's implied that the man is angry without it being explicitly stated, and it paints a clearer picture. Note how I shifted to the active voice in order to show. Now, with these definitions out of the way, let's read a little story written by yours truly. Within, I've intentionally included a variety of writing techniques. I'll then use this example to highlight these techniques and explain how they become available to you, the writer, when you write in the active voice. And for fun, I used a random generator online to determine the two sides of the conflict in this story. They spit out dentist and raccoon. Let's name this dentist Shane, a real dentist I know who should get a kick out of this. And as to why Shane has a conflict with this raccoon, well, let's read and find out. Shane pressed his hairy forearm against the girl's numb cheek, abrasive as steel wool, then leveraged the pliers on her lower jaw and cranked. The kid moaned. Shane grit his teeth. Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks, yet he did not relent. Not until he'd ripped the molar free. That wasn't so bad, now was it? Mama! Christ, all numbed up and still crying. Back in my day, they bred him tough. A splash of whiskey was all you got. Shane appraised the bloody tooth, nodding at his fine work. A fine extraction. Yes, fine indeed. This one's a little delicate, that's all. The door flung open and the brat's mother rushed in. She consoled her daughter, glaring at Shane all the while. It did little to dampen his satisfaction. "You were so brave. Hush now, it's all over. Give me a break." The molar was a bit stubborn, but came out whole. A fine extraction, I say. Shane rinsed the tooth off in the sink and offered it to the mother, still clutched in the pliers used to pull it. Might be worth a nickel to the right fairy. The mother extended a palm, lips pursed, but the raccoon was quicker. The feral beast leapt from some place unseen and snatched the tooth from Shane's pliers. It scrambled onto the counter. The fine array of dental instruments clattered on the linoleum floor, and the bandit scurried out the window, since pride ajar. The mother stumbled back, hands over her mouth, then rushed to her daughter's side. The kid giggled as blood dribbled down her chin. Hee, cute whack wabbit. But Shane was having none of it. Hot air rushed out his nostrils like a bull. He clenched his fists so hard his nails bit flesh. His left eye twitched, and he made the mother a solemn vow. "I'm getting you that tooth back." She shied at the intensity of his stare. "Oh gosh, no, that's really not necessary, Dr. Shane. It's fine, really, it's fine." He wouldn't hear it. "Taken from my very palm. It's on, you cheeky bandit, it's on." Shane whirled, his white coat to sail to his conviction, and strode out the door. He barreled through the next at corridor's end, and raised every pair of sullen eyes in his waiting room. The aroma of fresh-baked muffins filled his nose. He stomped over to the baked goods resting on the table beneath the alley window, but stayed his hand, and grabbed the broom instead. Crack! He snapped it over his knee, made a spear of it. Warriors go to battle hungry. Shane stepped out into the night. "Show yourself, thief!" A shadow scurried into the alley, and he gave chase. Knuckles white, he wound his muscles tight for a deadly thrust, and rounded the corner. It was a trap. Arr! He shielded his face against the horde of snarling, furry creatures, leapt upon him from all sides. Yellow Fang sunk deep, furious claws scratched, hot breath reeked. They brought Shane to his knees, bled him, tore his white coat to tatters, the one he'd worn back in university, and every day since. His broom spear clattered on the concrete, bitten from his grasp, and the vicious pack relented. Shane peeked through his bloody, grizzled forearms, and a deep rumble arose in his throat. One raccoon stood on its hind legs before the others, the girl's molar upon its palm. With the other, it pointed to the alley-side window and the table of fresh muffins beyond. Of course, little bastards after the muffins. A stiff breeze blew through the alley, and despite its chill, the 100 wounds which marred his body burned. He grit his teeth, stared the bandit in its beady little eyes, and charged. I didn't run back in Nam, I won't flee from some thieving rats. His war cry startled the raccoons, as did the jagged edge of his broom handle, dripping in his own blood, but so too did they find their rabid resolve. The ensuing clash put the histories of men to shame, lasting minutes and costing a dozen lives. But Shane was not among the corpses of the fallen. No, when it was all said and done, he knelt in the blood of his enemies, the girl's tooth clutched in his hand. He wailed at the moon, for they had not conquered him, nor bargained for a crumb, if just for one night that little girl would sleep with a tooth beneath her pillow. Shane died of rabies 2 weeks later. Worth it, the last words to pass his lips. Now, let's dive into the writing. I begin this scene in the midst of an action, a common thing to do, and use the active voice to show not only that a tooth is being pulled, but that Shane is not a gentle dentist. In this story, anyways. Note how every action here is active. Shane pressed, leveraged, cranked. The kid moaned, Shane grit. Tears streamed. He did not relent. He'd ripped. And note how it isn't necessary to include the subject of the verb in every sentence if the subject hasn't changed and the sentence isn't too long. Saying, then he leveraged the pliers, is unnecessary, because the reader knows it's still Shane. Also, take a look at my word choice. Pressed, abrasive as steel wool, leveraged, cranked, moaned, relent, ripped. All these words convey that this extraction is a rough experience for the kid, and notice how weak it would all sound if written passively and told instead of shown. The girl's numb cheek was pressed against by Shane's hairy forearm, abrasive as steel wool. The pliers were leveraged on her lower jaw and cranked. The girl was in pain. Shane was frustrated, but determined. The girl was crying, but Shane would not relent, not until the molar was ripped free. Notice how even with many of the strong words included, the passive voice completely kills the writing. It's boring and stagnant. What I want to unpack in this section is how the active voice is used in conjunction with both internal monologue and dialogue. Here, I use internal monologue to separate two active sentences, because if put right after one another, the pace would feel too fast. If you feel like you're writing one action after another, and it sounds a bit jarring, consider adding a bit of internal monologue to break it up. Next, I write what is commonly called an action beat, that is, an action that occurs between sections of dialogue so that the reader can maintain a picture in their mind of what's happening outside of just speech. It's important that these are active because they must be concise and not detract from the dialogue. If written in the passive voice, this section would sound something like this. The molar was a bit stubborn, but came out whole. A fine extraction, I say. The tooth was rinsed off in the sink by Shane and offered to the mother. Shane was still clutching it in the pliers used to pull it. Might be worth a nickel to the right fairy. This is messy and breaks the rhythm of the dialogue to the point where it feels like the dialogue is not planning on continuing, so when it does, it's a little jarring to the reader. First off, let me draw your attention to the two passive lines here, but the raccoon was quicker and, but Shane was having none of it. I included these two lines to show that, while other options exist, the passive voice has its place. The reason it works here is because each of these sentences is a transition that changes the direction of the narrative, and each does so by conveying information that is general, not specific, and doesn't relate to a particular action as of yet. Saying, but the raccoon was quicker, builds upon the previous active sentence in such a way that the reader can infer what the raccoon did quicker and who it was quicker than. These sentences also set up what comes after them by giving a bit of context to the actively written actions which follow. I follow up the passive sentence, but Shane was having none of it, with active descriptions that show what him having none of it entails. If I were to remove the passive sentence, the flow of the prose would be jarring and feel lacking. This is all to say that you often need transition sentences in your writing, and sometimes it's okay for them to be passive. So, again, I have an action beat here to give a little context to the verbal exchange, as well as another bit of internal monologue sandwiched between active sentences to control the pace. And once again, I take the reader through a series of actively written actions, the verbs being whirled, strode, barreled, raised, filled, stomped, stayed, and grabbed, with Shane as the subject of all but the verb filled. I then follow the onomatopoeia crack with the active sentence, he snapped it over his knee, made a spear of it, which is a good way to give immediate context to the sound in a way that a passive sentence couldn't. I then use an active description to show the physical state he's in, as well as another passive transition sentence. In my more serious writing, I probably wouldn't use so many of these passive transitions so close to one another, but in this whimsical example, I just wanted to highlight the technique. Again, everything here is written in the active voice, and you can see how writing like this allows me to convey things in a very visceral way. This is highlighted in the sequence. Yellow fangs sunk deep, furious claws scratched, hot breath reeked. They brought Shane to his knees, bled him, tore his white coat to tatters, the one he'd worn back in university and every day since. If written passively, I wouldn't be able to craft such short, immediate sentences, which are great for keeping the reader hanging on your every word. Because there are so few, each word carries weight. Again, refer to my video on conciseness if you want to learn more about that. Also, note how I use the active voice to describe sensations. Instead of saying, "he was in great pain," I said, "the 100 wounds which marred his body burned." Describing sensations and perceptions actively can be tricky, but I'll save an in-depth look at that for another video. Note how once more I am able to forego with repeating the subject of the verbs in the sequence. He grit his teeth, stared the bandit in its beady little eyes, and charged. There is only one he, even though these sentences are separated by periods. This allows them to be very immediate and impactful, and is often only possible when writing in the active voice. In this last section, I really lean into the humor of this little story, one which is absurd down to its core. No one would run after a raccoon who stole a tooth, and it's completely ridiculous to suggest that someone, upon being mauled, would put his life on the line a second time for said tooth. But that's what's humorous about it, and writing in the active voice allows me to show the absurdity of this scene through the dentist's actions, instead of just telling the reader that this is ridiculous. Trust yourself to show your story, and trust the reader to pick up on its tone. You should never explicitly state or tell them what the tone is. Within this last section, I wanted to show you how you can gloss over or summarize events. This is a useful skill. You don't always want to describe every action a character takes, which can be confusing to aspiring writers who are trying to stay in the active voice. This is an instance where you can use the passive voice sparingly, as I did here, but you can still write actively even while summarizing. For example, I said, with comedic grandiosity, "The ensuing clash put the histories of men to shame," instead of "The ensuing clash was epic." Then I went passive, with sentences like, "But Shane was not among the corpses of the fallen. No, when it was all said and done," before going active again, saying, "He knelt in the blood of his enemies, the girl's tooth clutched in his hand. He wailed at the moon, for they'd not conquered him, nor bargained for a crumb." Again, I get overly dramatic here with comedic intent, then end the scene with the humorous, active statement, "Shane died of rabies 2 weeks later. Worth it, the last words to pass his lips." And there we have it. There are yet more writing techniques used within this little story that I'd like to touch on, but I'll save that for another video with another title. Let me know in the comments if anything was unclear, or if something I said gave rise to a question I didn't answer. Otherwise, tune in next week for another technical writing video.